ideas for small plants. We tend to think of rock garden plants as plants in and around rocks, but everything, including the rocks, is going to be placed specifically for the plants. Alpines are a little bit more specialty than rock gardens, simply because alpine plants are plants that are used to growing on top of a mountain. So this might be an example actually of a style of rock gardening because most of these plants are small, despite the fact that this is actually just a series of steps. All of the plants are planted into the little crevices between the various rocks. Here's another example of a rock and or alpine style garden. This one happened to be in Chicago. It's very difficult for us to mimic the conditions on top of a mountain or in a rock style garden that you might find in a desert, for example. But we can get a general similar feel, or we can use very small dwarf plants to get that alpine appearance. So here's kind of a mix of a regular perennial border in the back with the larger plants and the rock garden plants and the alpine and small plants kind of trailing over the front of that retaining wall or planted it into the little crevices between the rocks. When we think of alpine plants, true alpine plants grow at a much higher elevation, often above the tree line. Now, they don't have to be above the tree line, but in many cases they are found above tree lines. They're used to low temperatures. They like it generally very dry. They're used to very windy conditions and poor gravelly soils. That is basically the opposite of the Midwest. We tend to be humid in the summer. We're very wet and sloppy in the wintertime. Our soils are nutrient dense. People mumble and grumble about our heavy clay soils because they do tend to hold a lot of moisture, leading to poor drainage. And we also tend to get ample rainfall. Last summer notwithstanding, in general, Central Ohio tends to get ample rainfall. That's the exact opposite of of the conditions that you'd find on the top of a mountain. But we can do our best to try to mimic those conditions. So this is a very small rooftop garden where somebody has brought in a lot of gravel to plant some of these plants, and then they have more normal plants in the planters in the background. These are hypertufas, which are a cement mix. And you can mix the cement with gravel and you can put fiberglass in it to lighten it up and things like that. But these, again, are plants that are in those that are more used to our weather, but also like a well-drained soil, which is what you can do in a container. Here's an example of a container that has plants that are conditioned more to desert locations or are dwarf plants. Again, these are plants that you could put in the ground if you had decent drainage. A lot of these plants are sedum, and then you can see the hypertufa or the concrete style container that they're planted in. This really shows the containers themselves better than the plants, so you can see what these hypertufas look like. They look very much like rocks themselves. Here's another example. This is at a nursery. And if you look at the little feet for tags, this company calls these little plants steppables because you can actually step on them. So if you planted them in the ground, in between flagstones, for example, and they got stepped on here and there, it wouldn't bother them that much. They are not like a turf that can handle all kinds of foot traffic, but they can handle some. Here's another example of very small dwarf woody plants. So these are all dwarf forms of plants that do well for us. They're just very small. A lot of these plants will grow less than an inch a year. Here's a great example of that. We're going to concentrate this time a little bit more on the plants than on the conditions and things like that. But here's a lacebark elm. Normal lacebark elm is a 50 to 60 foot tall tree. This one is about 2 to 3 feet tall. We have many, many dwarf evergreens that we could use and dwarf conifers. Here's a dwarf Norway spruce. This one will grow less than a quarter of an inch a year and will maybe eventually over 20 to 30 years get to 3 to 4 feet. This is another one. If you've heard of dwarf Alberta spruce, that's a conical shaped plant. That's a very, very slow grower. This one is a round mound and again will grow less than about a half an inch a year. Here's a different type of spruce, a Serbian spruce. Now this one has been grafted onto a standard, so it looks like a lollipop. So if you look at its trunk, that's not its normal growing. They grew that on that trunk so it looks like a lollipop. This one grows a little bit faster, and this might make an appearance if you're trying to scale everything down. This one might replicate a full-size tree, even though it's only going to be about 3 or 4 feet tall. Here's a Japanese pine, and if you take a look at its trunk, you can see it's a fairly thick trunk. This plant is probably close to 40 years old at this point, and you can see it's only 2 or 3 feet tall. This is a Mugo pine. I don't know the cultivar. It wasn't labeled within this particular garden. Most Mugo pines in the wild are going to be 20 to 30 foot tall plants. In our landscapes, we do see the dwarf forms that range anywhere from about 2 to 4 feet tall. This one right here is about a foot, maybe a foot and a half. We could also use some bulbs to replicate some larger sized plants, particularly in the spring. So this one is a daffodil, and you can see it looks a little bit different than a lot of daffodils. It's one of our species daffodils. They get about 2 or 3 inches tall. This is a more normal looking daffodil. It's one of the smallest of the quote unquote normal looking daffodils. And this one will be about 6 or 7 inches tall. We can do the same thing with some of our species tulips. For those of you who might be familiar with the large egg-shaped tulips that happen in spring, this one is a very small species tulip, Turkestan tulip. These are about 4 to 6 inches tall total. And there you can see it growing outside, so they are fully hardy for us. That particular container is about 12 inches tall. This one, Battellini tulip, is kind of borderline for us. But again, take a look at what this plant is growing in, and what you'll see is gravel. So this is a plant that really likes excellent drainage. It's only about 4 inches tall. Here's an indoor grouping of it. And it's a little bit taller in here because again, the conditions are a tad better, but it's still only about 8 inches tall. This particular display is indoors. If you live in the Cincinnati area or south, that should be hardy. Central Ohio, borderline. Definitely if you're in Northern Ohio, it will not survive the winter. This is a fully hardy iris. It is one of the first reticulate irises to flower. This one flowers actually a couple of weeks before more of the quote unquote normal reticulate iris. This one, depending upon our weather conditions, from mid-February to mid-March is typically when you're going to see this plant show up. And you can see it's only about an inch tall. They're barely out of the ground and they're already flowering. Other bulbs, anemones. Anemones, like many of our bulbs, you plant these in the fall and then they come up in the spring. They come in this bluish color. They also come in white or in pink. And again, maybe 4 to 5 inches tall. This is a bromeliad. And this is a really cool bromeliad. This is fully hardy for us if you have impeccable drainage. And that's the challenge. Notice what this plant is growing in. It's basically growing in gravel. And our winters tend to be sloppy and wet. Think of how it's been the last few weeks. We've had a lot of precipitation, whether that precipitation is snow, which the plant can handle, or rain, which the plant really doesn't want. Cold temperatures, not a problem. Sloppy soils, that's the challenge. So it has to really, really, really be good drainage. If you touch this plant, it will bite. It's basically a plant version of a porcupine. This is one of the rare asters that actually has not had a name change. This is Alpine aster. This is a true alpine plant that is just as happy in our more heavy clay, nutrient-rich soils, but it'll be about 6 or 8 inches tall, flowering with a big daisy-like flower, just like you can see here. If you want something smaller, this is a ground cover aster. So the Symphyotrichum is the new name for aster. I'm not going to ask on a quiz any of the scientific names or anything like that. This is not an ID class. But just for those of you who are aware, you might see this under aster for nurseries that haven't quite made that name change. You're more likely to see it under Symphyotrichum. This is a little ground cover, 2 to 4 inches tall, with delicate white flowers like this in the fall. Most of our asters do flower somewhere between August through October, and this one's definitely more in that September-October range. You want more of a spring flowering? This one is a dwarf goat's beard. Our native goat's beard is a big, bold, bodacious plant that loves wet locations. It's 6 to 7 feet tall. Huge white flowers. This one's 4 to 5 inches tall. It also will have white flowers in the spring, and this is its fall color. So you can see a little bit of an orangish red fall color, and it's only about 6 or 8 inches tall. The plant we're looking at here is actually the one growing out of the side of the retaining wall. The muscari or grape hyacinths are what you're seeing at the top of the retaining wall. That's not the plant that we're looking at. The one is the rock cress is that lighter purplish blue growing out the side. This is another one that really likes rocky, gravelly areas. So perfect coming out of a dry stack retaining wall like this. Cheddar pinks will actually grow in our ground. They are a semi-evergreen, and so they have that kind of bluish green foliage year round. It often doesn't look as great in the winter time, but it does look good in the spring through the summer. And generally in the spring, it'll have a nice pink flower to it. If you can get down to where that plant is, or take a cutting and bring the flowers up to your nose, they usually do have a very nice smell. They're going to be a little taller, maybe 8, 10 inches tall in flower. This one amuses me because this is one of our barren worts or epimediums. This is grandiflorum, which means large flower. Nanum, anytime you see that word as part of a cultivar, that means dwarf. So this is the dwarf large flower barren wort, which just is somewhat amusing in my opinion. So the flowers are larger than the leaves, which is very unusual with barren worts. Most of the time, our barren worts have smaller flowers than the leaves. This one has a very large white flower. They tend to flower kind of late winter, early spring. And this particular plant is going to only be about 6 or 8 inches tall. Epimediums are great for railroad gardens. You can see this is a more normal sized epimedium. There's a mugo pine in the background. And these plants, similar to rock gardens where you're growing things small, they're growing so that they're trying to show the railroad portion of it in scale so that the railroad looks like it's going through a forest. The buildings are scaled down. So everything in this garden, again, we're using our dwarf gardens, our rock garden plants, our alpine plants, so that the railroad itself looks like it's in scale. We probably know baby's breath as if you've given or gotten flower arrangements. They are the tiny little white flowers that are in between a lot of our other flowers. But this is a ground cover version, and it also has pink flowers instead of white flowers. And this is another rock garden or alpine style plant that loves poor drainage. Poor drainage in the drains really well sort of way. So again, growing in gravel and in rocks. We can use hostas. We know hostas do really, really well. There are lots of tiny, tiny little hostas. Popo is the smallest of the hostas that I know of, at least. It's about 2 inches tall and 4 inches across. Cabotan's a little bigger than that, about 6 or 8 inches tall and wide. And you can see a much narrower leaf. This one's got a yellowish green in the center. Medusa is kind of in the lower left-hand portion. It's the white and green. And again, that one's a bit taller than a lot of our dwarf plants. Not that it's huge. It's going to be about 10 inches tall and maybe 12 or 15 inches across, so a little bit larger. But hostas do well in the Ohio climate. Here's an example of one of those steppables. This is sedum acre or moss stone crop. And if you walk on it while walking in between all those stones, all those flagstones, or you're walking around the patio, or you step on the plant, it will handle that no problem. A lot of our sedum are like that. They really like poor drainage in the sense of drains very quickly. So dry, gravelly, rocky areas, they do very, very well in. Hens and chicks are another one, and there are so many different types of hens and chicks. I'll show you a couple of them. This one looks like it has little spider webs in it. This is not actually spider mites or spider webs or anything. This is just the natural condition of the plant. Here's a teeny tiny one that's kind of got a reddish color. And if you look at that sign, those signs are about 2.5 inches by about 1.5 inches. So it gives you an idea of how tiny those little hens and chicks are. Here are hens and chicks growing in a rock garden in a container. And so you can see how the rocks are placed. There's soil and gravel mounded in there. The rocks hold that in place. And you can see all of these different types of hens and chicks. There are dark green ones, light green ones, reddish ones. If we look over on the left-hand side of the container, you will see kind of almost a little daisy-like flower, little white daisy-like flower right here. Those are hens and chicks in flower. They have a very unusual looking flower. And when the hen flowers, after she's done flowering, she will die. So if this plant here in the middle flowered, that plant would then die and decompose, and all of these little chicks would then use that space to fill in to get bigger. Finally, this one happens to be at the Huntington. The Huntington is out in California. Definitely put that garden on your list to go see. But when you walk through it, you will be like, I have landed on another planet. This is absolutely amazing. Most of the plants there are desert style plants. So they're not hardy for us. Some of them are hardy for us on the condition that you have absolutely the perfect drainage. They want soil water that moves really, really quickly. So sandy soils, gravelly soils, those are the types of soils that they like. So for us in central Ohio, the challenge that we have with rock gardens is actually drainage. Our drainage is slow, particularly in the winter and early part of the spring. Spring tends to be very wet. So what we want to do is incorporate as much sand or gravel as we can, or better yet, grow these plants in containers where we can dictate the type of soil that grows. As always, if you got any questions, do not hesitate to ask.